in the city, meeting one another face to face. We have to make the best of it here on Zoom, but it's great that everyone's here. I'm just waiting for a nod from colleagues at MPC that they think it's time to get going, but I think we should probably make a start. Thanks, Claire. So welcome again, everyone. My name is Paul Parker. I'm the recording clerk of Quakers in Britain. We're a faith organisation with a strong campaigning bent. We campaign for issues around peace and social justice and have been doing so for 350 years or so, and no intention of stopping anytime soon. So it's very good to see you all. Huge thanks to Clothworkers for hosting us for this event as part of the series of events that they work on with NPC. It's really wonderful to have the support of Clothworkers for these important conversations of charity leaders and trustees about how we make charities as effective as they can be. Do tweet about the event as we go along using the hashtag NPC trusteeship. I hope we can, on Twitter at least, generate a bit of enthusiasm for charity sector campaigning in this general election year and make sure that everybody knows that charities are ready to make a bit of noise in the interests of their beneficiaries. We're going to have two presentations to start the event this afternoon, and then lots of time, I hope, for questions and discussion afterwards. Do drop questions into the chat. Our colleagues from MPC are going to be collecting those up and making sure we address as much as possible in the time we've got. And when we get to the discussion, then I'll explain again how we want to make that work, but I'll be asking you to use the electronic raise hand button that you'll find at the bottom of the screen. There's a lot of us here and it's easier to spot people if you do that. And just a reminder that we are recording the event, so you can come back to anything that you missed, and we'll also circulate the slides to you afterwards by email, together with all the sort of links and things that come up during the afternoon, and a survey for you to fill in so that MPC can adjust the format of future events in the light of your feedback. So it's a general election year, as you may have noticed. You can kind of feel the heat rising at the moment, can't you, as everyone gears up for that. Civil society campaigning is important at all times, I think, but in general election years, I think we think about it even more than usual. And we know that it will be absolutely vital for civil society organisations, such as those represented here this afternoon, to engage in campaigning this year to help set policy, ensure our beneficiaries are heard and their needs and interests are looked after in the kind of maelstrom of thinking and sort of jockeying for position that goes on at election time. So it's not surprising really that there's lots of noise at the moment about charity campaigning. Even the Charity Commission, not always enthusiasts for charity campaigning, have been reminding charities that campaigning is a legitimate way to meet charitable purpose, and have put out some really quite helpful messaging in the last few weeks to remind charities that they should campaign and can campaign and shouldn't be put off from that if it's the right way to achieve their objectives. And in NPC's most recent State of the Sector report, which was launched a few days ago, there was a reminder that the public also want charities to be involved in the political conversation. That's not always what politicians tell us they want, but the public is definitely saying that. A majority of the public think charities should be involved in the political conversation, and at the moment only 15% of the public, it's about 1 in 6 people, think charities are too political. So I'd quite like us to be a bit further along that spectrum. I think charities are probably among the most political organisations we have. We need to be part of that conversation. And so I do think there's a call there from the public to be bolder. And interestingly, 59% of those of the public also want government to work more closely in partnership with charities. Again, that's from the NPC State of the Sector report. So there's a real clamour, I think, for us to be active in this area, to seek out active ways of working with government and campaigning, taking our messages to government to make sure we do the best by the beneficiaries of all our organisations. And so I think the question that I want to start us off with is, why does this feel so hard? And maybe the answer is it isn't. And we need to be there. We need to be part of this conversation. We've got two great speakers this afternoon to both, I think, to enthuse us about the need for charity campaigning, but also to tell us a bit about the hows and the do's and don'ts of that. So we'll hear from them in turn. I'm going to introduce them both to you, and then we'll hear from them. So our first speaker will be Sanchita Hosali. Sanchita is the CEO of the British Institute of Human Rights, where she's championed that charity's practice-based work. She has expertise in human rights and equality law, policy and practice, and over 20 years experience of working both in the UK and internationally. She's also a trustee of the Centre for Women's Justice and was previously the chair of Rights of Women. None of those are organisations known for keeping quiet. And so I'm sure we'll hear from Sanchita some great examples of that. And then after Sanchita, we'll hear from Suhan Rajkumar, who's a senior associate at the law firm Bates Wells, advising charities, not-for-profits and businesses seeking to have a positive social impact. Suhan has a particular focus on campaigning and electoral law. He's very much my go-to expert on anything in that area, and he's recognised in the Legal 500 for his work on this stuff. He also advises on a wide range of charity governance, commercial, regulatory and crisis management issues. So he's a go-to person for a whole lot of things. Outside of Bates Wells, Suhan is a charity trustee himself, currently as chair of bail for immigration detainees and a trustee of community action for refugees and asylum seekers. So we really couldn't wish for two more informed and enthusiastic speakers in favour of charity campaigning and how to do it. And without further ado, I'll let Sanchita give us the benefit of her experience on that. Then we'll have a little time for questions, and then we'll hear from Suhan. Over to you, Sanchita.
Great, thank you so much, Paul. No pressure. Hopefully that's sharing my screen and my slides. Is that correct? Excellent, great. So I thought I'd start with a little bit about me, kind of just to sort of contextualize it and sort of what my experience is. So a kind of decade or so of experience in senior leadership roles in the charity sector, particularly, but that came at the precise moment in which we started to grapple with the Lobbying Act and all of these questions about what freedom of expression for charities actually does mean. Sort of coming off the back of the Cash for Questions crisis, we then end up in a situation where it's actually charities and trade unions who are getting caught up in lots of the additional legal regulatory frameworks that we're putting in place. So that was certainly a rude awakening into the world of charity law, election law and lobbying. But kind of more broadly than that, I also have about 15 or so years of experience of holding trusteeships across the charity sector, and specifically on quite different work to what I do in my day job. So kind of quite very vocal kind of strategic litigation led campaigning organisations. So kind of, although my background is in campaigning and previously kind of I was a campaigner, the organisation I run now is not a campaign group, but we very much do use campaigning as a tool. And I think that that's kind of important for charities to remember, because I think sometimes there can be a real fear about what those terms mean, and that actually campaigning as a tool for charities is often vital, not just kind of something we want to do or should be doing. And kind of whenever I talk about charity law, and certainly the organisations that I've been on the board of and that I am on the board of now, talking about the law is one of the things that I am there to do. And I think that there's a bit of a fear factor often with the law. We feel like the fear that it's kind of there to be like, you know, something that is kind of almost like the thing that to kind of beat us down and stop us doing things. But actually, I'm kind of very much in favour of seeing kind of the law as a tool to empower us, actually know what our legal framework is, know it really well, use it really well, be familiar, be informed. And particularly, actually, if there are things in our legal framework that we maybe don't agree with, that's okay, but do it from a position of being empowered about it. So as we've kind of Paul's talked about, and I won't be the first or last person to say this in the next hour, undertaking political activity and campaigning is absolutely something that charities can do, and as we've seen in recent weeks, can often be vital. The Charity Commission, our regulator, is telling us this can be a vital activity. It's just about knowing kind of what the rules are around that. So it's always about focusing on our charity's purpose. It's about not being party political, stressing our independence, being balanced, not being the sole purpose of our organisation, and not kind of being a vehicle for any one person's views. And it's just about making that really practical, and kind of using that as your framework. So for me, kind of for the approach that I take both as a trustee and a CEO, it's actually just about kind of recognising that that legal framework is about how we do our job, and it's about good governance. It should be the bread and butter stuff. It shouldn't be anything that we should be kind of sitting there fearful of and not kind of unsure or uncertain about. It's just about kind of, this is how we make good decisions, and using that really proactively and positively. So you'll hear me say CC9 and CC27 probably several times in the next few minutes, and that's the Charity Commission guidance on campaigning, which is CC9, and CC27 is the guidance on good decision making. If you kind of just use them, they're so useful. It's just a way for you to demonstrate as a trustee how you're making good decisions in line with the Charity Commission framework, and you can use it as a way to support campaigning. It doesn't need to be a block. It's actually kind of the way that you can evidence that what you're doing is appropriate within kind of the bounds of charity law, and kind of most importantly is the thing that you need to do in order to support your beneficiaries and deliver on your charity's objectives. So I will say it probably several times, get really familiar with CC9 and CC27. There are lots of kind of short guides as well from the Charity Commission, which are really useful. But my board minute notes, for example, are littered with references to that, because we just go to it kind of whenever we're making decisions about campaign issues. Like, have we kind of checked that off? Yes, we have. So I thought I'd kind of just talk a little bit about the experience of the organisation that I run. And a little bit about campaigning in general from a leadership perspective. So kind of we can talk a bit more about elections maybe in questions. But in terms of kind of using it as a day-to-day tool, my organisation is a practice-based organisation. So in some respects, you could look at it and say, well, why are you doing kind of campaigning work? Because you're not a campaign group. You're kind of there to support the implementation of the Human Rights Act. You deliver, training, learning, development, support services. And for us, we've always been really clear that actually in that policy space about kind of the thing that we are talking about, which is human rights law, our practice space gives us a really important evidence base to contribute to those discussions. And actually, kind of just doing the work that we're doing without recognising when there are kind of big political, kind of with a small p, threats to that kind of bit of law that we use, human rights law, and not doing anything about that, we're not really addressing lots of the issues that are fundamental to our charity. So there's lots of kind of reasons why actually, especially if you're kind of practice-based or service delivery based, that actually you could look at that and say there are really clear links to our charitable objectives as to why we do need to campaign on particular issues. And for us at the IHR, that's been something that's really increased kind of definitely since 2010. We've had to really increase the work that we've done supporting speaking up for human rights law, really supporting lots of other charities who are quite nervous about it, because it's kind of that seen as, political campaigning, and we're not sure that we can do that. But actually kind of situating that as a really key issue in the sort of broad concept of social justice that touches on so much of the work that so many charities are doing. It's really increased and ramped up since December 2020, when the attacks on the Human Rights Act and human rights law in the UK have moved from kind of rhetoric to actual, here are some laws to scrap kind of what you have. So the sea change was very different. So we kind of moved from sort of broad political campaigning to actually we have to be very targeted in the political campaigning now, as very clear government action. to remove a piece of law which is fundamental to protecting human rights, which is our charitable objective. So again, kind of emergency board meeting when this was all happening, we used CC9 and CC27. We were like, right, campaigning is vital for BHR. We had a whole position paper that we put together and kind of set out why this is important for us, but that our trustees had demonstrated that campaigning was a vital tool that we needed to use in this situation. I was kind of thinking about the experience. I kind of thought, well, it's all of 2021 and 2022 and most of 2023. And I was like, I can't just talk to you about 3 years worth of work. That won't work. So I thought I'd pick an example that of the sort of campaigning work that we've done in this period, which is really, on the face of it, looks like it was outside of the scope that maybe we should be doing. So the government consultation paper on bringing in the Bill of Rights that would have scrapped the Human Rights Act, and I use consultation in very loose terms because the question of should we do it wasn't even a question, it was assumed that it was happening anyway. So lots of issues about consultation. But one of the key issues with it was that there were no accessible versions. So there was no easy read, there was no BSL, no audio version of that. And that's quite a big issue because you've got human rights law issues with it, you've got equality law issues, you've got public law issues, and you've also got the government not following its own guidance on how to do consultations. So for several weeks, we kept raising this. And all of our usual kind of, sort of quiet policy work and the relationship stuff with government was not working at all. And so we decided that actually we probably needed to do something about this, because as an organisation, a significant proportion of the people that we work with and support are people with learning disabilities, kind of neurodiverse people, people with kind of mental health issues. So a whole range of people who have just been excluded from this consultation on whether their rights should get removed or not, essentially. So there was a real risk that actually we could be seen as engaging in something really party political, because this is very much associated with the ideology of the party in government. So there's a clear kind of, potential risk there for us. We don't do litigation-based work, but the only way left now to challenge this was through a legal case, or at least the threat of strategic litigation. But that's not what we do as an organisation. There's also the issue about authenticity. This is an issue for disabled people. It's not a legal question per se. So what's our position here in taking this piece of work? Like, how do we justify that? And it was also something that I've put a few weeks there, but I think it was actually probably something like 13 days in the end, kind of the time frame that we had to turn this around. So we had to kind of a quick meeting with our trustees. We kind of got, right, there's directions here to support this campaigning. We've already got our position paper. This falls really quickly really clearly into what we've set out for our campaigning position. It's vital to our objectives. It's vital to our operating model with disabled people. We can justify the expenditure, minimise it through pro bono, and we must be focused on supporting disabled people's organisations to speak up in this. So it was really important for our operating model that we were doing this campaigning, but we were doing it together. So we brought together a range of the disabled people's organisations that we work with in our practice-based work who shared our concerns around this. We supported one of those organisations to lead the campaign. Several other organisations joined as part of the litigation group, and we had a wider consultative group as well. And BHR essentially kind of provided the secretariat function. So I found myself as a lawyer who isn't a lawyer being a lawyer, but not actually being a lawyer. So it was a lot of hats to be wearing at that moment, and we worked with Rick Ivan Sweeney around pro bono support. But it's one of those situations where on the face of it, that kind of campaigning could have been seen as really party political, really outside the scope of our organisation. But actually in practice, it wasn't, because we'd done the work of understanding the legal framework and using that to make our decisions. And 11 minutes before our deadline, the government came back and said 3:49. We gave them till 5 p.m. and they came back at 3:49. to say, please don't issue legal proceedings. We're going to email you in a minute to tell you all the things we're doing. And it was not a perfect win, but it was a win enough for the disabled people's groups that we worked with to kind of get a better outcome than we had done. But as I say, something that really is the kind of campaigning that we would, on the face of it, it wouldn't have been something that you would have normally seen us do. But it was important to kind of embrace and use the kind of charity law and guidance to make that decision and not be afraid of it. And that would be the bit I would sort of say around kind of charity campaigning. Like, don't fear it, just know the law and be empowered by it. I'm a big believer in documenting, document. Kind of be really clear about if you're going to campaign, when you're going to do it, on what and why and how. Think about your voice and how you use it. I think it's really important to say, like, tones can be really different. The tone of the organisation I lead will often be very different to the tone of the organisations that I'm a trustee of, because they have different objectives, different things that they're trying to achieve. And that's okay, that's fine. It's just about kind of being clear about what that is. Make sure you know your evidence, be robust, know what the critique is and be ready to counter it. I think sometimes when we're campaigning, we spend so much time creating our own case that we don't actually address what the critique would be. And I would say the balance for me is always, what's going to be the criticism and how do I address that, and be really secure kind of around that. Kind of make sure it's the best way to meet your charitable objectives, and kind of just demonstrate that, know what your red lines are. And when we do risk management, I think there's, again, a focus on the risk of campaigning, but also what's the risk of not campaigning as well. So I will leave it there because I've probably gone way over time. I did not look at my clock. Sorry, Paul.
You're not too bad, Sanchita. Thank you. And it was packed with useful material. And I think particularly, lots of modeling there for others to look into about, working with stakeholder groups, particularly groups of disabled people in that case, and local groups as well, and how you as a national organisation managed to kind of coordinate and enable a campaign that wasn't necessarily in your own voice, but was very much in their interest. So a really interesting case study. Do drop questions in the chat, everybody, if there are things you want to explore. I'm going to press straight on, if I may, and invite Suhan to speak to us from the legal perspective about this, but do save up your questions so that we have lots to discuss at the end of this. So Suhan, over to you for 10 minutes or so.
Brilliant, thank you so much. So just while my slides are pulled up, to introduce myself a little, as Paul said, I'm a lawyer at Bates Wells advising charities, and I'm also a charity trustee, so hopefully can offer that perspective as well. Really interesting to hear those kind of practical examples from Sanchita about the campaigns that you've worked on. I just wanted to kind of go back to the basics of what CC9 says and what charity law says, and then look through a couple of other examples, both of what charities can do safely within the law, what is permissible political activity for charities, and then looking at a couple of examples of where there might be risks that you might need to navigate. So moving to the next slide, it's worth taking a step back and thinking about what the basic framework around charity campaigning is. And the Charity Commission distinguishes in its guidance, CC9, which I think Claire has helpfully linked in the chat, between political activity and campaigning, which is not political. So this kind of non-political campaigning, which is aiming to change individual behaviour, encouraging people to be vegan, is perfectly permissible, and there's no limit on it, as long as it is obviously in furtherance for your charity's objects. That also extends, if we move to the next slide, to campaigns to impact corporate behaviour. So this campaign from Greenpeace, trying to get Lego to disengage with Shell, which did work. It was a successful campaign. Again, it's seen by the Charity Commission as non-political activity, and there are no limits in terms of charity law of how much of that a charity can do, as long as it furthers its purposes, whatever's set out in your governing document, and subject to kind of compliance with other law and other risks. So if you're running this kind of campaign, there's obviously a risk that corporates with big legal budgets will be able to try and clamp down on what you're doing. So charity law isn't the only thing to think about. Moving to the next slide, what the Commission means by political activity or political campaigning is a campaign which is intended to influence law or public policy. And so this example from Shelter campaigns to improve the legal framework we have for renters and to influence government policy around house building are political activity, but they're perfectly permissible political activity for Shelter, which as a housing charity, I don't actually know what its objects are, but these activities will fall squarely within its purposes. The Charity Commission doesn't think that campaigning to enforce existing laws is political activity. And so that means often kind of a judicial review which says this new government policy is unlawful because it doesn't comply with the government's, with our existing law, shouldn't be seen as political activity. Moving to the next slide. As Sanchita says, the Charity Commission has really helpful guidance in CC9 and then has specific guidance in charities, elections and referendums. In both of those pieces of guidance, what it says is that there's no limit on non-political activity and campaigning that you can do as a charity, but where you're carrying out political activity, which is intended to influence law or public policy, that can't be your only purpose. So you couldn't establish a charity which had a purpose to change British human rights law to make it more extensive. And it also can't be your sole and continuing activity, because the Charity Commission would see that as essentially being established for that purpose. But it can be your sole and continuing activity for a period of time. And so taking a human rights charity, which is established to advance human rights, it would be perfectly legitimate to for that charity to have an ongoing campaign to save the Human Rights Act for 2 years, which obviously is a campaign to influence government policy, but would be permissible for an extended period of time as long as the trustees thought that was appropriate. The Charity Commission then, in its additional supplementary guidance, charities and elections and referendums, draws out some of the key risks it thinks that exist for charities when campaigning and carrying out political activity, particularly ahead of elections. This guidance doesn't always apply, unlike CC9, but it applies from the date the election is called until the date of the election. It doesn't say anything kind of drastically new, it just draws out principles from CC9, but it applies those to policies, publicity, parties, and candidates, which it thinks are the key risks. On policies and publicity, it broadly says that charities can campaign on a policy and can give publicity to a policy, but have to be careful to guard their independence carefully. And in that context, it says that charities should not compare their views to the policies of a political party. Obviously, in reality, I think lots of charities do go further than that, and there's a very low risk of regulatory enforcement if you were to, say, have an environmental charity comment on the Labour Party's manifesto and the Conservative Party's manifesto and explain why, you know, some elements are good and align with the charity's policy asks and other elements could do better and don't align with the charity's policy asks. What the Commission, I think, is really getting at is a kind of very stark comparison, the kind of classic example of a charity manifesto with a table with a big green tick for the political parties which match your manifesto asks and a big red cross for the political parties which don't. That would effectively be seen as an endorsement, a party political endorsement, which isn't allowed. All of this political activity obviously should be seen in the caveat that charities can't undertake party political activity and must really carefully guard their independence and try to manage the public perception of whether they're carrying out party political activity. And that's essentially what the guidance says around parties and candidates. Moving to the next slide. So I wanted to then look at a couple of examples of charity campaigns from recent years to think through some of the risks. On this slide, we have a couple of examples from the Trussell Trust, a food poverty charity. And these examples, I think, show the kind of really wide range of political activity which is permissible from charities. None of this, I think, engages any serious level of risk. And it shows the Trussell Trust making a call for the government to prioritise a need for the end of food banks, comments on the spending review and kind of criticises government policy, and talks about a specific politician, Rishi Sunak, when he was Chancellor, and has a call to action for people to get in touch with the Chancellor and make their views heard on food bank policy. The next example shows some of the pitfalls. This is a slide, on the next slide, a tweet from Oxfam, which they tweeted in 2015, I think, ahead of the election, which resulted in the Conservative majority. And the Charity Commission investigated this tweet and eventually published a report saying that Oxfam hadn't taken enough care to manage the risk that people might perceive the organisation as acting in a party political way. You might find that surprising because it doesn't talk about any political party. It focuses purely on policy issues, which are directly aligned with Oxfam's anti-poverty objects. But the tweet received a lot of controversy, complaints were made to the Charity Commission, and the Charity Commission felt that Oxfam could have done more to avoid being perceived as party political because of the language it used in this tweet. Now that, to me, feels really severe. But Oxfam, I think, probably had to spend a lot of time engaging with the Charity Commission for this investigation. And there was then a critical case report published on the Charity Commission's website. The Charity Commission system now means that anytime anyone looks up your charity, if there has been a regulatory report, this will be immediately linked and flagged from the charity register. Moving to the next slide, a more recent example of where things can engage a level of risk. I'm sure many of you saw this tweet from the RSPB a couple of months ago, or if you didn't see the tweet, you probably saw the fallout. Charities obviously can campaign on policy proposals which are directly relevant to their charitable purposes, and that's what the RSPB was doing here. It was commenting on the government's U-turn on environmental protections when there was a significant U-turn around nutrient neutrality, I think, in October or thereabouts. What the RSPB were doing was saying that the government and the ministers responsible for that policy change had lied because they'd made one commitment and then changed their position. In that context, I think it's hard to argue that they were being party political. However, the Charity Commission investigated and said that this tweet was a serious mistake. The tweet was published, I would say, around 6 months ago, and the Charity Commission, although it did release a statement saying it was a serious mistake, have still not yet published their final investigation report, as far as I'm aware. You can see from the Charity Commission's perspective that there is a risk that this tweet, even though it can be perfectly justified on a charity law basis in furtherance of the RSPB's charitable object to protect the environment, there's a risk that someone might perceive it as party political, particularly because of the way Twitter works. If that first image was on someone's Twitter homepage and the next tweet, which kind of went into more detail and explained why this allegation was being made, might not have been easily visible, and someone might have felt that it was a party political message. This also received additional controversy and kind of pushback because one of the RSPB's own trustees commented on Twitter to say that this tweet went too far. And, you know, you can have a debate about whether or not it did go too far. The Charity Commission, I think, would say that it did, whereas I'm not totally sure it did. But it does show the importance of having an organisationally agreed approach around charity campaigning, probably a political activity policy which explains what level of risk you're willing to engage with when you're undertaking political activity. I have a couple of more examples, but I'm conscious of time, so maybe I will stop with the slides there, if that's okay. We can come back to those examples after questions, depending on how many questions there are. But maybe just before that, I wanted to very quickly talk about the Lobbying Act, which we haven't covered yet today, but people might have heard of. The Lobbying Act often has a chilling effect and is seen as really concerning for charities, and it's separate to charity law and applies to any type of campaigner. Broadly, it means that if you're going to undertake regulated activity, which is public-facing activity, which might reasonably be regarded as intended to influence people to vote in a particular way, you need to register with the Electoral Commission. The Electoral Commission and the Charity Commission both recognise that many charities won't undertake regulated activity because often they're issue-based campaigning, which is permissible under charity law, should never be seen as encouraging people to vote in a particular way. We'll be talking about policies, the need for the Human Rights Act, or the need to meet net zero, or the need for a change on food bank policy. It would be rare for charities to do something which could reasonably be seen as encouraging people to vote in a particular way. But the Electoral Commission's view is that some issue-based campaigns could be seen in that way, particularly if they talk about having your say, making a difference, kind of use imagery that relates to voting or the election, or even if they're kind of on an issue which is particularly divisive, and around which there's a clear party political divide. So, for example, in the 2017 election, a campaign around the dementia tax, using that language, which is very politicized, might have been seen as passing the purpose test. The Lobbying Act doesn't say you can or can't do anything. It just implements a registration framework, which is a bit burdensome, but is totally fine and charities can engage with. So kind of, I don't want to go into that in too much detail, and we'll share some resources after this if that's helpful. But broadly, I just wanted to explain what it was and say that it shouldn't be an obstacle, but it is something that's worth thinking about. Paul, I'll hand back to you.
Thanks, Suhan, for that really comprehensive overview of how all this hangs together. We've got a couple of questions in the chat. Do drop some more in there, everybody, so that we make sure we cover everything that you want to know. And I might call some of you to explain your questions a little bit more to make sure we've really understood and answered them. So Graham, if I might come to you in a moment for you just to explain the question that you've put in there and say a little bit about it. Can I ask a question though first to you both? You touched there, Suhan, on the kind of what crosses the line in terms of the sort of tone of campaigning, and particularly those tweets that you shared. And we've heard in the last few months a few times particularly from Orlando Fraser, the chair of the Charity Commission, about the need for charities to kind of campaign in a spirit of kindness. And I'd be interested to hear what you think about that. First of all, whether the law has anything to say about that and charity regulation, but also what happens when asking nicely doesn't work. Sanchita, do you want to chip in on that, and then I'll come to you, Suhan?
It will. I have so many issues with kindness, and especially I think kind of coming from a human rights perspective, because often people are like, well, if you do human rights, you're being kind and it's all fine. And it's like, well, no, actually, sometimes human rights is not just about kindness. And a lot of the time, it's actually about really difficult, thorny, clashing issues, which kind of, really can get people's backs up on, a spectrum of different viewpoints on different issues. I think it's been unfortunate from the Charity Commission to use that language, but what I would say is I've noticed, particularly since January, like I've been to quite a few things with the Charity Commission kind of staff, quite a few different events, kind of looking at sort of what they've been putting out now. And I think they've kind of moved away from that tonal issue kind of around do it with kindness. And I think actually the social media guidance from the Charity Commission that's kind of now been finalised, the difference between the draft version and then the post-consultation version, where actually there's a much bigger emphasis on, ensuring that freedom of expression is protected, that actually tone is a matter for trustees to determine, as opposed to, we have this idea of all charities must be kind. I'm not saying it should be unkind necessarily, but I just don't think it's a very helpful narrative. I do though think tone is really important, and it's something that is definitely an issue that is like at the forefront of my mind when I've got my different hats on as a CEO and as a trustee, because the tones of the organisations that I'm involved in will be very different, but they're agreed. And we know kind of what the tone is for each of them. So, for example, kind of with BIHR, it's very much play the issue, not the man. It'll be very rare that you would find us directly saying something about a particular government minister or politician, for example. That's quite rare for us. And if we do, there's been a discussion behind actually doing it. So our tone is quite different to, say, kind of when I'm a trustee of kind of very campaign forward women's rights organisation that are about, we need to test the boundary of the law here, and actually we need to say things that are really uncomfortable and controversial. So I think tone is important, but it's an issue for trustees to determine. Like, we're not being regulated on kindness, irrespective of, I think, some unfortunate and clumsy language.
So, anything to add to that?
Yeah, no, I agree with all of that. I think every organisation will have a different approach, and kind of echoing what you've said, I'm the chair of bail for immigration detainees, and we work in the immigration detention sector. And there is a lot of space to campaign with a lot of anger there, but our approach at BID is to be very policy focused, academic, to work closely with sector bodies and kind of implement change at a day-to-day level. There are other charities working in the space who do brilliant work, who'll have ads on Instagram with pictures of Rishi Sunak or Suella Braverman and be really out there. The Charity Commission thinks that campaigning with respect and tolerance is a legal duty which stems from a charity's obligation to protect its assets, which include its brand and its reputation. And they've said that repeatedly. From a legal perspective, I think that there is space to argue with them about that, because as we've talked about, there are just so many issues where a government proposal could well be antithetical, if that's the word, to your charity's objects, and there just is no space to campaign with tolerance, and you have to be really out there. It's also important to remember that different organisations, going to what Sanchita said, will have different stakeholders. And a kind of very conservative with a small c royal charity has a different group of stakeholders to a activist charity who have loads of really kind of engaged volunteers. And so there are lots of arguments you could make to the Charity Commission. There's a separate question about, is an angry tone useful to you? Is it aligned with your objectives? And is that argument with the Charity Commission one that you want to have?
Thanks. I think that point about sort of reputation and seeing that as an asset is really important. I'm blessed with trustees who recognise that having an edgy reputation is important to Quakers, and so if we're not bold enough, they see that as a reputational risk. But I'm aware that lots of other charities take a more cautious approach. I'd like to pick up a few questions which are about the sort of technicalities of some of this. So, Graham, would you like to put your question, and then I'm going to come to Stephen Toft and Leah Davis straight after.
Yes, my question really was from the point of view of being a grant-making charity might have very broad charitable objects, for example, for any charitable purposes worldwide. Now, I accept the principle that charities can campaign in line with their charitable objects, but when you've got charitable objects like that, kind of what are the objects, if you like? Now, I see it as quite easy when a grant-making charity with objects like that is giving a grant to other charities, because it's then the other charity, it's their responsibility to see that it's in accordance with their charitable objects. But suppose a grant-making charity gives it to a body which is not a registered charity. We seem to be in a grey area.
Thank you. There's quite a lot to that question. I'm going to pick up another question, and then I'll come to Suhan on that particularly to unpack some of that, and then Sanchita afterwards. Stephen Toft, would you like to just say a little bit about your question?
Good afternoon. I'm from the Brent River and Canal Society. We campaign to protect the River Brent and the green spaces alongside it. I was just wondering about the influencing of council policy, which is effectively what we're trying to do, because we've been campaigning to get local nature reserve status for a lot of the areas around the River Brent. Now, actually, what happened 2 weeks ago is the council actually did a U-turn and said that they would grant it. So when we signed up for this, we thought we were going to have a more difficult time than we have had. But what it has meant is that the other political parties have brought their politicians and their mayoral candidates up and align themselves with our campaign, which kind of puts us into a party political space. And we've tried to get it to the point where we have as many of them as possible, not one political party. But I would imagine I assume if campaigning to change government policy is political, then council policy would be covered as well.
Suhan, do you want to pick up those two? And I'll come back to Leah's in a second. I think there's a risk, otherwise we run out of memory space for the different strands of this.
Yeah, of course. So taking that second question first, in a word, yes. Campaigning to change any public law or policy. So that includes government, local government, and other kind of public bodies would count as political activity. And that also includes international government policy. So kind of there was a significant charity law case for the Human Dignity Trust, which works to campaign against laws which criminalise homosexual acts in international jurisdictions. The Charity Commission said that was political because it's changing international law. The Human Dignity Trust, with the support of Bates Wells, successfully argued that it wasn't political activity because it was saying that those countries should comply with overarching human rights legislation they'd already signed up to. So it was actually enforcing existing law, not changing law. But otherwise, if you went to a country which hadn't signed up to international human rights legislation, that would be political activity, which doesn't mean you can't do it, but means it needs to be in furtherance of your objects and can't be the only thing you're set up to do. Coming then to the first question around grant funded. Broadly, yes, it means you have a huge amount of discretion. You can do anything political which is in furtherance of your objects. But it also means I think there can be a bit more of a risk sometimes because there are lots of nuances in English charity law, and where you have one set of objects, you kind of understand in great depth, you know, as Sanchita will, human rights objects, what the charity law restrictions and nuances around that are. And for human rights, they're kind of very complicated. Whereas if you're a grant funder funding across all sorts of things, as you say, if you're granting charities, you can take a level of reassurance that they know what they're doing and they're regulated. When you grant to non-charities, you might internally just need to do a bit more thinking, a bit more research to understand, okay, would this be charitable? If not, we can't fund it. But it does also mean that you probably have a bit more leeway and discretion to engage with things which are or might be perceived as party political. So in the same way that a charity could not work closely with only one political party, that would be perceived as supporting a political party, you as a grant funder might grant funds to, say, an organisation closely affiliated to the Labour Party, which is working to improve our benefits policy because that will combat poverty, as long as you also grant to other political parties, or not to political parties, but to people working closely with political parties, because you're managing political neutrality across the spectrum of your grant recipients. So it does mean you have lots of flexibility, but some nuances to think about.
Thanks, sir. Sanchita, anything to add on those points?
I guess only in terms of the grant funding, I think just for me that it feels like there's a lot more of an internal issue, not kind of just a regulatory issue, but it's a little bit like how I feel with human rights, because our purposes are around human rights. It's pretty much you can make most things fall within that bracket, and actually internally it's about us being really clear as a trustee board, like what our strategic priorities are to further our charitable objectives, and that's what we use as the kind of narrow down. So I guess it's also just that, isn't it? It's the documentation of kind of knowing what strategic decisions you're making around funding for kind of potentially charitable or non-charitable purposes.
Great, thanks. Leah Davis, nice to see you. Would you like to say a bit more about your question?
Yeah, so quite a few charities will do joint advocacy, and I understand there's some rules, I think maybe from the Electoral Commission, around what you're allowed to do and what you can spend, particularly in the run up to elections. So I just wanted to know what the rules were around that.
Can I come to you, Sanchita, first, because you gave us such a great example of coalition campaigning, and then Suhan, perhaps you can fill in on the technicalities more.
So I think this is where knowing whether you're in an election period or not in an election period is really key, because it's slightly different. So it's not that you can't do it, it's just what's the regulatory framework around you when you do. And so kind of when outside of election periods, like joint advocacy and campaigning is very much the way we would do the work, as in the example I gave, kind of working with disabled people's organisations and across all of our work around kind of campaigning to secure the Human Rights Act. So it's very much kind of about that joint campaigning approach. I will say that there can sometimes be kind of, you have to have a really good understanding with all the organisations you're working with, and sometimes like we might be working with 300 organisations, and so kind of having a process where that's managed just kind of for the practical aspect, but also when you're in those groups to be really mindful that some of those organisations will be charities that have to comply with the charity law framework, but also some of them won't be charities. And so actually kind of being able to, sometimes you might need to temper language, because kind of the things that you wouldn't be able to say kind of, you know, within the charity law framework, other organisations will quite happily say, and that's necessary and needed. But when you're joint campaigning, if it's charities and non-charities, you just need to know that actually some of that stuff kind of needs to be worked out. So it's more of a practical issue than a regulatory one, but it is different in election years, which we are now in the election period, even though we don't know when the election is. It doesn't sit well with my human rights. It's like, that's retrospective law, but that's the way the law works. We don't know when the date is, but we're in the period, because it will be within 365 days. But that's just, it's more about knowing what the rules are there. So it's kind of, there are levels of spend that once you reach them, kind of there's reporting requirements around that on kind of regulated activity, if what you're doing is regulated activity. And again, it's just being mindful of for me, it's the practicalities of that. So knowing what the framework is, knowing what you're doing, because the limits are really low and can add up very quickly. So it's just, again, kind of what I said earlier, like it doesn't need to be a fear, but you do need to know it and kind of make sure that you're abiding by it, but using that as the platform for what you're doing, kind of not sort of going into it unknowingly.
So, do you want to point to anything particularly to help people know it? Tell them where to find the right guidance, perhaps?
Yeah, of course. So the Electoral Commission has quite helpful guidance, and I can share in the link. I did a webinar on kind of the election law framework in a bit more detail, which I can share. But broadly, the limits that Sanchita is talking about, if an organisation is going to spend more than £10,000 on regulated activity, including staff time, in the year before an election, they need to register. And where joint campaigning comes in is if you have a common plan or arrangement with another organisation. You both need to account for each other's spending. So say an organisation had a common plan or a joint campaign with another organisation and said, we're going to encourage the public to vote for candidates who are against the Rwanda plan. You focus on London, we'll focus on Wales. That would be a joint campaign, and both organisations would need to account for each other's spending. And so both would have to register, even if each one only spent £9,000, say, because that would trigger both over the £10,000 threshold. For so many campaigns, actually, they won't pass the purpose test. There'll be issue-based campaigns which talk about the salience of issues, getting politicians to sign up to policy positions, etc. But it is worth thinking about. We also have produced some kind of free legal agreements for campaigners to put in place to say, here's what our campaign's about. None of us will do regulated activity as part of this campaign, which can be helpful. You know, even that often won't be necessary if you're not even getting near that kind of campaigning. But for some campaigns which might touch on that, might be helpful to put those in place just in case there is a regulatory question later down the line. Thanks very much.
We're getting quite near the end here, and there's a couple of other points in the chat I want to pick up very quickly. There's a lengthy comment from Duncan at Lloyds Bank, taking a slightly different view on how you achieve balance across grant funding, which is well worth reading, Graham, if you haven't spotted it there. But I don't want to dive into that now. But I do want to just pick up on this other question Duncan's raised around political activity policies for charity staff, which is something we haven't touched on yet at all. So in kind of no more than 1.5 sentences, Suhan and then Sanchita, is there anything you'd like to say about that?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So all charities now need a social media policy if they're going to engage in social media, which obviously everyone is. So I think it comes up whether or not you have a political activity policy. And I agree, I think lots of charities are taking a very restrictive approach, which I think is unhelpful and not required by the Charity Commission's guidance. But that, you know, there's a spectrum for social media and more generally. At the one end, you could say, well, we're a charity, we really protect our reputation. You can't comment publicly in the charity's work if you have a political position or a clear political view. At the other end, you might say, look, you can do literally whatever you want, as long as on your personal profile, you say that your views are your own, you're not representing the charity. For most charities, I think somewhere in the middle will be appropriate. But, and this is the classic charity law answer, it will totally depend on the circumstances, because there might be some examples where, you know, say Sanchita was running as a candidate for the Green Party, it might actually be not that helpful for her to be fronting campaigns work on the Human Rights Act. In other circumstances, it might be totally fine, but it depends on the salience of an issue, the profile of the candidate, and kind of, I think, becomes almost a strategic question as well as a legal one. But broadly, I agree. I think while having a policy in place is important, it would be a shame if all of those approaches were too restrictive.
Thanks very much. Sanchita, very quickly.
Very quickly, so I think the social media guidance stuff, that's part of our regulatory framework. Kind of just for me, it's like we're going to get on and do that. I'm not convinced about a political activities policy myself. I think we're really open at BHR. Our team has training on charity law, campaigning law and election law as part of their induction, and also every year we kind of do a refresher with the whole team. So it's always in our team's mind, like we know sort of how we approach things, we know how we make decisions. So it's not that we're going to say, well, for this particular type of work, this is the restriction that we work with under. It's just that we apply that thinking across kind of how we make decisions broadly. And I would say that's kind of one thing I would really advocate for. I think it's really important that trustees are on top of kind of charity law. Of course, it's our legal obligation, but also don't be afraid to empower your staff on this stuff. They don't need to be afraid of it either. And actually, it's going to be their actions that determine whether there are going to be any regulatory issues. So it's really important that they feel confident about this stuff. And I would say one of the things I'm really proud of is that I think you could ask any member of staff at BHR and they would be able to talk to you a little bit about charity law. And I think that's a really positive thing.
Great. Thank you both so much. I think I speak for all three of us if I say, you know, I hope we've left you this afternoon feeling like you understand the issues here better. I would be horrified if we've left you thinking, oh, this is all terribly difficult and we should stop campaigning immediately. I think all of us are saying, know what you're doing, be bold, get out there this year particularly, but all the time as well, and make sure you're campaigning well in support of your charitable purposes. Thank you again to Sanchita and Suhan for bringing your knowledge and experience to this afternoon, and huge thanks to Clothworkers for sponsoring this series of events. The next event in the series is on May the 2nd, and it's around how can charity trustees centre lived experience. I think that follows on really well from this, and the example Sanchita gave about lived experience coming into play in that campaign around a government consultation was a really great one. So do book onto that and come along to that. And also a reminder that tickets for MPC Ignites, the MPC's annual conference on the 18th of September are available as well as early bird rates at the moment. I can say honestly from my own experience, it's always a great event that leaves me thinking how much more there always is to learn about how to run a charity well and make sure it's as impactful as possible. So thank you all for being here. Thanks to Sanchita, Suhan, thanks to Clothworkers. See you all again, I hope, another time.